Hi, and welcome to BOMA International's latest Deeper Dive video presentation. I'm John Celestri, and the topic today is the industrial marketplace. This, of course, is a companion piece to our latest Deep Dive online feature, which you can access at boma.org/deep dives. Three of the experts who were critical to the feature's research are here today. Samantha Turner is Senior Real Estate Manager for Weyerhaeuser Company. Eileen Lewis is a BOMA Fellow and Director of Property Management for Torch Properties. And James Breeze is Senior Director, Global Head of Industrial and Logistics Research for CBRE. Thank you all for being here today. Let's begin our conversation with the current state of the market, the fundamentals of absorption. What's happening out in the market now?
One of my primary jobs is tracking industrial real estate and what the trends are. And if you look at industrial demand trends, I mean, they've been pretty strong for 13 years, but we've never seen the level of demand we witnessed the last 18 months. And the key to all this demand, and be interesting to hear what everyone else thinks right now, is inventory control. Companies are essentially banking industrial space to hold more inventory on shores and more locations. And there's three main reasons. There's a growing online consumer base. There's a need to protect inventories from future disruptions. You know, many companies want to avoid running out of items that we ran out of the last 2 years. And also in some cases, what we're hearing from occupier clients is that holding more inventory in the US is a way to actually save overall supply chain costs money, because transportation costs can make up over 50% of a company's total supply chain cost spend. Well, renting a facility can typically only about 6% of a total supply chain cost. And I mean, we hear in the news diesel fuel costs and the cost to ship across the ocean, how they're just escalating and skyrocketing. And even though rental rates are up a pretty astounding amount, companies are spending way more on transporting goods. So in some cases, we're finding that occupiers are actually saving some money by leasing more buildings, which is pretty interesting. So you add all that up with the solid economy, population shifts, and from what we track, it's creating a record level of demand.
The old adage that they're not making more land is making it more and more challenging. Zoning and some of the requirements for ratios of buildable area to detention ponds, things like that, makes it more and more challenging to find developable land, find the footprint that you need, get it in an area where your transportation costs don't just kill the opportunity for the real estate deal because you found something, but it's too far out. The challenges with the container shipping, getting stuff out of the ports, we were hoping that was all going to come to an end of Q4 into Q1, and that still seems to be an issue. Every time you feel like maybe the end is in sight, there's another headwind. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that everybody is kind of sitting there very anxious in anticipation of the next thing to come. And so they're reacting maybe a little, I wouldn't say irrationally, but doing things that maybe they wouldn't necessarily do in typical times.
Well, and there's no question that the pandemic has been very good for industrial properties. I mean, as James indicated, industrial has been strong for the last 13 or so years, but the last 2 years have really mushroomed in many, many areas. We all hear the stories about Amazon, and Amazon continues to expand and increase their logistics base and not only for their inventory, but getting the inventory to the customers. So that's just one big example. I think that the pandemic has changed, and we won't know this obviously until we look back at the history, but I do think that the pandemic has changed how we as consumers purchase our goods. And I don't anticipate that we will be going back to, where we were pre-pandemic.
Some of the trends in real estate ownership and the money chasing it is also driving up the cost. You have spec development. I was just having a conversation about a week ago with a brokerage firm, and they were talking about spec developers building, I guess, just getting the dirt, going through the entitlement process, going out and selling the building as if it were fully leased to owners, to landlords, and they're buying those in anticipation of the dirt with the building on it.
You have to look at demand. In 2021, there was 270 million square feet of industrial facilities that were completed. And by the end of the year, 80% of those were already leased or off market, 80%. And so again, that just validates building more. And so right now there's 514 million square feet under construction, and that's 200 million square feet more than there was just 12 months ago. But 35% of that is leased before it's even been completed. So when you see these numbers, when you see there's a vacancy rate of only 3%, when you see that things like leasing and net absorption are still more than what's available under construction, it definitely validates, building more, that these buildings are going to be leased. And there's really just nothing out there that shows any kind of a fear of an oversupply situation right now. So that's why you're seeing the kind of transactions that you're talking about continue to occur.
I think one of the other challenges that we see is folks are so busy trying to get somebody's attention for a new development opportunity. That can be very difficult right now. Natalie, I don't know if you're seeing that on your end.
We are. And, we are running into many situations where, we've, just as an example, we've had over a 30% growth in our rental rates in our market, which is a smaller market, over the last 2 years. And that's significant. And, our tenants are sometimes stuck in situations that they can't get out of because there's just no place else for them to go. So it's a really, really interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and there's some markets where the rents have increased 65% in the last 12 months, let alone 38% in the last 2 years. And this is starting to spread. You used to see this rent growth just in coastal markets, the Inland Empire, Los Angeles, New Jersey. Now you're starting to see 20-30% rent growth just in 12 months in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Louisville. So this rent growth trend is accelerating. It's not decelerating or stabilizing. It's actually increasing its pace.
Let's talk about the nature of the net lease arrangement that seems to dominate the industrial market, and how that changes the manager-tenant relationship as opposed to what might be in an office environment. Eileen, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
The key there, I think, is maintaining great relationships with your tenants and making sure that maintenance as well as needed repairs are being done, and having that communication with the tenants as well as the documentation is really, really key. It does get a little bit tricky. I mean, when you have great corporate tenants, such as Samantha's company, that's usually not an issue. But in a market where you have a lot of mom and pop type tenants, that can be really problematic. One of the other big issues I think that is upcoming continues to be the sustainability discussions that are being had. Recently, now I'm in Tucson, Arizona, so recently our mayor put out a press release that Tucson will be carbon neutral by 2030. That's a little bit of a scary thought when you have a lot of aging buildings, and how can you make that leap to carbon neutral in a 45 to 50-year-old building. It's a little tricky, and it requires, again, great communication between your tenants and then in this case, the governmental authorities. So it will be interesting to see how that evolves. But I do think that the sustainability is very important to many of our tenants, as well as to our community as a whole. And, partnering with our tenants to do the right things, because technically they're responsible in their leases for certain things. It all comes, a lot of it comes down to dollars and cents and how that makes sense for the tenants as well as for the landlords.
I think one of the things in the net lease is people can take it very simply and literally and just going, okay, tenant does this and the landlord has the roof and the subgrade, electrical and plumbing and walls. But if you have that partnership that Eileen was talking about, for instance, sharing your HVAC maintenance agreement, providing information that you are doing paving repairs or other maintenance work. Sometimes what we've done at our facilities is we will have annual walkthroughs with the assigned property manager. What I have found is it keeps lines of communication open. When you have a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options, you're there for a long time. But when you need to leave a facility, if you haven't had those open lines of communication, or if you've been able to demonstrate what you've done, it can make the exit or the divorce very challenging. One thing that tenants also forget about is, they don't own the property, the landlord does, and they have a long-term interest. But to protect the tenant, a really good thing I always recommend is doing a final agreement, a surrender and restoration agreement between the landlord and tenant that states, the 2 parties have agreed. And that way, when Eileen and I win the lottery and we're off somewhere else, there's a document to cover that everything was fine and that it was all taken care of. So, housekeeping even at the exit is always a good idea.
Surprises are not a good thing for either the tenant or the landlord. And, again, I can't stress enough how important that partnership is and the ongoing relationship over the years. And Sam made a great point with regard to that agreement. That's another key thing that can really help smooth the transition.
And also bring things up if there are issues at your building that are a landlord responsibility. For folks at my end, at the corporate real estate, but then you have the end occupiers, make sure that you're communicating to your local teams who sit in these spaces. If you see a drip of water or you see an issue, don't just let it pass by. So make sure that you have, it's full open lines of communication, and that maybe they're letting the property manager know, but make sure they copy the corporate real estate person as well, so that they're aware that if the landlord doesn't respond, that you need to take the appropriate action.
Last question. Where do you see the market going in the next 5 years?
I'll jump in real quick. Competing with Amazon. It's a cliche, but it's for real.
I also see it being in a smaller market. Larger tenants are having trouble finding space in the larger markets, and they're pushing into the smaller markets. Our market is less than 2 hours from Phoenix, which is a major market for the country. And we're seeing a lot of companies that are starting to gobble up the space in Tucson just because it makes sense from a logistical standpoint. So I see larger corporate tenants being more of a priority in the smaller markets.
I can't speak about specific companies or say specific company names, but I will say that demand last year came from a very diverse tenant set. And actually, third-party logistics providers were the most active occupier set. And I think that's going to not only be the same thing, but actually expand over the next few years because of the difficulties that occupiers have in finding space and finding labor and paying these costs. We're just going to see much more occupiers just throwing up their hands and saying, you know what, I'm just going to outsource my distribution. And so from that standpoint, we're going to see many more 3PLs enter into the market, expand in the market. I don't think that we will see the record number of transaction volume that we saw last year continue. I think that's just not viable, but we will continue to see, very good activity. I don't see anything changing in terms of the pace of rent growth, at least for the next couple of years. We'll definitely have to see, transportation costs, inventory control really start to settle, and I think decline before that happens. Or there just has to be, some sort of situation where retail sales can significantly drop and companies just have to stop expanding for there to be any kind of, I think, relief in rents from that standpoint. But nothing's really out there that's a big enough headwind for me to be afraid of any kind of like a negative absorption, a big increase in vacancy rates. From that standpoint, the market's going to stay very tight and a positive market for landlords and a tough market for occupiers.
And that's a great way to end our conversation. Thank you all for your time today. It's been a pleasure working with you throughout this process. Thanks again and have a terrific day.